Welcome to Week 10 of Instructional Design 684, Design and Instruction of Online Courses. Your facilitators for this block of instruction are Peter DeVisser and I, Sven Mensen. Together, we will be exploring cross-cultural perspectives in online learning. This is rather a broad and complex topic, so we have used the results from the pre-class survey you provided to significantly narrow our focus. One of the questions we asked in the survey was in what environment you as instructional designers were expecting to work, whether in the primary or secondary school systems, in higher education, or in the private or business sector. Well, according to those results, it appears that none of you will be working in a K-12 environment. Next, we wanted to know about your experience in taking online courses with international students. Well, according to the results, over 70% of you have said yes. For those of you who have taken online courses with international students, we wanted to know if you are aware of any cultural differences that affected or may have affected their participation or their success in the course. In looking at the results, it seems that many of you noted language barriers as well as logistical problems, including being in different time zones. We also wanted to know if you have ever completed a course on cross-cultural competence, international relations, or something similar. The results? Well, less than 30% of you have ever had any formal training in cross-cultural competence. When we asked what experience you have had with an international learner population, it appears that all of you had at least some exposure. And it also appears that many of you have attended school in a foreign country. For those of you that have attended school in a foreign country, we wanted to know what the biggest differences were in terms of how education was delivered. Well, this included a technology perspective, the teaching approach used, the role of the instructor and that of the students, and also potentially gender role perspectives. Now, the answers were interesting. Some of you noticed a difference in the instructor's approaches to teaching and grading. Though using different terms, each of you has indicated a desire to learn how to integrate cross-cultural competence into your instructional design work. Now, taking all of those factors into consideration, this instructional block will focus on applications for higher education and corporate training. The term globalization is used more and more these days. Globalization for us as instructional designers means an increase in a diverse learner population. We need to be equipped with knowledge to effectively handle this changing world we live in. Cultures do vary in their approaches to education, so it follows that there are similar cultural differences when it comes to online education. Given your survey responses, we intended to scratch the surface in developing cross-cultural competence for instructional design work, as well as explore the research into different perspectives on online learning to contextualize the need for doing so. At the end of this microcourse, learners will be able to describe online learning activities in terms of their potential home culture biases and cross-cultural barriers to learning, as well as techniques that we can employ to mitigate them. Our learning objectives here include identifying culture general domains, matching given culture-specific items with the culture general domains they are most closely associated with or manifestations of, recognizing areas in instructional design work that may be prone to home culture bias, defining cross-cultural competence in terms of the associated skills that comprise it, defining 5 of the primary skills that comprise cross-cultural competence, and discussing language proficiency as a potential barrier to learning and why or why not accommodations should be made for potential language barriers. To kick things off, let's see how cultural differences play out in the corporate world.
To understand the business of mythology and what a chief belief officer is supposed to do, you have to hear a story. of Ganesha, the elephant-headed god who is the scribe of storytellers, and his brother, the athletic warlord of the gods, Kartikeya. The two brothers one day decided to go on a race 3 times around the world. Kartikeya leapt on his peacock and flew around the continents and the mountains and the oceans. He went around once, he went around twice, he went around thrice. But his brother, Ganesha, simply walked around his parents once, twice, thrice, and said, "I won." "How come?" said Kartikeya. And Ganesha said, "You went around the world. I went around my world. What matters more?" If you understand the difference between the world and my world, you understand the difference between logos and mythos. The world is objective, logical, universal, factual, scientific. My world is subjective. It's emotional. It's personal. It's perceptions, thoughts, feelings, dreams. It is the belief system that we carry. It's the myth that we live in. The world tells us how the world functions, how the sun rises, how we are born. My world tells us why the sun rises. Why were we born? Every culture is trying to understand itself. Why do we exist? And every culture comes up with its own understanding of life, its own customized version of mythology. Culture is a reaction to nature. And this understanding of our ancestors is transmitted generation from generation in the form of stories, symbols, and rituals, which are always indifferent to rationality. And so when you study it, you realize that different people of the world have a different understanding of the world. Different people see things differently, different viewpoints. There is my world and there is your world. And my world is always better than your world. Because my world, you see, is rational, and yours is superstition. Yours is faith. Yours is illogical. This is the root of the clash of civilizations. It took place once in 326 BC on the banks of a river called the Indus, now in Pakistan. This river lends itself to India's name, India, Indus. Alexander, a young Macedonian, met there what he called a gymnosophist, which means the naked wise man. We don't know who he was. Perhaps he was a Jain monk, like Bahubali over here, the Gomateshwara Bahubali, whose image is not far from Mysore. Or perhaps he was just a yogi who was sitting on a rock, staring at the sky and the sun and the moon. Alexander asked, "What are you doing?" And the gymnosophist answered, "I'm experiencing nothingness." Then the gymnosophist asked, "What are you doing?" And Alexander said, "I am conquering the world." And they both laughed. Each one thought the other was a fool. Gymnosophist said, "Why is he conquering the world? It's pointless." And Alexander thought, "Why is he sitting around doing nothing? What a waste of a life." To understand this difference in viewpoints, we have to understand the subjective truth of Alexander, his myth, and the mythology which constructed it. Alexander's mother, his parents, his teacher, Aristotle, told him the story of Homer's Iliad. They told him of a great hero called Achilles, who, when participated in battle, victory was assured. But when he withdrew from the battle, defeat was inevitable. Achilles was a man who could shape history, a man of destiny. And this is what you should be, Alexander. That's what he heard. What should you not be? You should not be Sisyphus, who rolls a rock up the mountain all day only to find the boulder roll down at night. Don't live a life which is monotonous, mediocre, meaningless. Be spectacular, like the Greek heroes, like Jason, who went across the sea with the Argonauts and fetched the golden fleece. Be spectacular, like Theseus, who entered the labyrinth and killed the bull-headed Minotaur. When you play in a race, win. Because when you win, the exhilaration of victory is the closest you will come to the ambrosia of the gods. Because you see, the Greeks believed you live only once. And when you die, you have to cross the river Styx. And if you have lived an extraordinary life, you will be welcomed to Elysium, or what the French call Champs-Élysées. The heaven of the heroes. But these are not the stories that the gymnosophist heard. He heard a very different story. He heard of a man called Bharat, after whom India is called Bharata. Bharat also conquered the world. And then he went to the topmost peak of the greatest mountain in the center of the world called Meru. And he wanted to hoist his flag to say, I was here first. But when he reached the mountain peak, he found the peak covered with countless flags of world conquerors before him, each one claiming, I was here first. That's what I thought until I came here. And suddenly, in this canvas of infinity, Bharat felt insignificant. This was the mythology of the gymnosophist. You see, he had heroes like Ram, Raghupati Ram, and Krishna, Govinda, Hari. But they were not two characters on two different adventures. They were two lifetimes of the same hero. When Ramayana ends, the Mahabharata begins. When Ram dies, Krishna is born. When Krishna dies, eventually he will be back as Ram. You see, the Indians also had a river which separates the land of the living from the land of the dead. But you don't cross it once. You go to and fro endlessly. It was called the Vaitarni. You go again and again and again. Because you see, nothing lasts forever in India, not even death. And so you have these grand rituals where great images of mother goddesses are built and worshipped for 10 days. And what do you do at the end of 10 days? You dunk it in the river. Because it has to end. And next year, she will come back. What goes around always comes around. And this rule applies not just to man, but also the gods. You see, the gods have to come back again and again and again as Ram, as Krishna. Not only do they live infinite lives, but the same life is lived infinite times till you get the point of it all. Groundhog's Day. Two different mythologies. Which is right? Two different mythologies, two different ways of looking at the world. One linear, one cyclical. One believes this is the one and only life. The other believes this is one of many lives. And so the denominator of Alexander's life was one. So the value of his life was the sum total of achievements. The denominator of the gymnosophist's life was infinity. So no matter what he did, it was always zero. And I believe it is this mythological paradigm that inspired Indian mathematicians to discover the number zero. Who knows? And that brings us to the mythology of business. If Alexander's belief influenced his behavior, if the gymnosophist's belief influenced his behavior, then it was bound to influence the business they were in. You see, what is business but the result of how the market behaves and how the organization behaves? And if you look at cultures around the world, all you have to do is understand their mythology, and you will see how they behave and how they do business. Take a look. If you live only once in one life cultures around the world, you will see an obsession with binary logic. absolute truth, standardization, absoluteness, linear patterns in design. But if you look at cultures which are cyclical and based on infinite lives, you will see a comfort with fuzzy logic, with opinion, with contextual thinking, with everything is relative, sort of, mostly. You look at art, look at the ballerina, how linear she is in her performance. And then look at the Indian classical dancer, the Kuchipudi dancer, the Bharatanatyam dancer, curvaceous. And then look at business. Standard business model, vision, mission, values, processes. Sounds very much like the journey through the wilderness to the promised land, with the commandments held by the leader, and if you comply, you will go to heaven. But in India, there is no the promised land. There are many promised lands. Depending on your station in society, depending on your stage of life. You see, businesses are not run as institutions by the idiosyncrasies of individuals. It's always about taste. It's always about my taste. You see, Indian music, for example, does not have the concept of harmony. There is no orchestra conductor. There is one performer standing there and everybody follows. And you can never replicate their performance twice. It is not about documentation and contract. It's about conversation and faith. It's not about compliance. It's about setting. Getting the job done by bending or breaking the rules. Just look at your Indian people around here. You'll see them smile. They know what it is. And then look at people who have done business in India. You'll see the exasperation on their faces. You see, this is what India is today. The ground reality is based on a cyclical worldview. So it's rapidly changing, highly diverse, chaotic, ambiguous, unpredictable. And people are okay with it. And then globalization is taking place. The demands of modern institutional thinking is coming in, which is rooted in one life culture. And clash is going to take place, like on the banks of the Indus. It is bound to happen. I have personally experienced it. I'm trained as a medical doctor. I did not want to study surgery. Don't ask me why. I love mythology too much. I wanted to learn mythology, but there's nowhere you can study, so I had to teach it myself. And mythology does not pay. Well, until now. So I had to take up a job, and I worked in the pharma industry, and I worked in the healthcare industry, and I worked as a marketing guy, and a sales guy, and a knowledge guy, and a content guy, and a training guy. I even was a business consultant doing strategies and tactics. And I would see the exasperation between my American and European colleagues when they were dealing with India. Example, please tell us the process to invoice hospitals. Step A, step B, step C, mostly. How do you parameterize mostly? How do you put it in a nice little software? You can't. I would give my viewpoints to people, but nobody was interested in listening to it. You see, until I met Kishore Biani of the Future Group, you see, he has established the largest retail chain called Big Bazaar, and there are more than 200 formats across 50 cities and towns of India. And he was dealing with diverse and dynamic markets. And he knew very intuitively that best practices developed in Japan and China and Europe and America will not work in India. He knew that institutional thinking doesn't work in India, individual thinking. He had an intuitive understanding of the mythic structure of India. So he asked me to be the chief belief officer and said, all I want you to do is align belief. Sounds so simple, but belief is not measurable. You can't measure it, you can't manage it. So how do you construct belief? How do you enhance the sensitivity of people to Indianness? Even if you're Indian, it is not very explicit, it's not very obvious. So I try to work on the standard model of culture, which is develop stories, symbols, and rituals, and I will share one of the rituals with you. You see, it is based on the Hindu ritual of darshan. Hindus don't have the concept of commandments, so there's nothing right or wrong in what you do in life. So you're not really sure how you stand in front of God. So when you go to the temple, all you seek is an audience with God. You want to see God. and you want God to see you, and hence the gods have very large eyes, large unblinking eyes, sometimes made of silver. So they look at you because you don't know whether you're right or wrong, and so all you seek is divine empathy. Just know where I came from, why I did the jugaad, why did I do the setting, why I don't care for the processes. Just understand me, please. And based on this, we created a ritual for leaders. After the leader completes his training and is about to take over the store, we blindfold him. We surround him with the stakeholders, the customer, his family, his team, his boss. You read out his KRA, KPI, you give him the keys, and then you remove the blindfold. And invariably, you see a tear because the penny has dropped. He realizes that to succeed, he does not have to be a professional. He does not have to cut out his emotions. He has to include all these people in his world to succeed, to make them happy, to make the boss happy, to make everyone happy, the customers happy, because the customer is God. That sensitivity is what we need. Once this belief enters, behavior will happen, business will happen, and it has. So then we come back to Alexander and to the gymnosophist. And everybody asks me, which is the better way? This way or that way? And it's a very dangerous question because it leads you to the path of fundamentalism and violence. So I will not answer the question. What I will give you is an Indian answer, the Indian head shake. Depending on the context, depending on the outcome, choose your paradigm. You see, because both the paradigms are human constructions. They're cultural creations, not natural phenomena. And so the next time you meet someone, a stranger, one request. Understand that you live in the subjective truth, and so does he. Understand it. And when you understand it, you will discover something spectacular. You will discover that within infinite myths lies the eternal truth. Who sees it all? Varuna has but 1,000 eyes, Indra 100, you and I, only 2. Thank you. Namaskar.
Now, if you take nothing else away from that TED Talk you just watched, remember that final bit of advice and parting request. Depending on the context, depending on the outcome, choose your paradigm. The next time you meet someone, a stranger, one request. Understand that you live in the subjective truth, and so does he. This, in essence, is the key to cross-cultural competence, and is applicable not only to business and education, but to almost every aspect of life that involves interpersonal interaction, which covers a lot of life. So let's talk about what comprises this notion of cross-cultural competence, also known as 3C. What are the knowledge and skill areas that make up 3C?
It's important to clarify some terminology in order to ensure we're all on the same page and using a common lexicon. The terminology itself is the foundation upon which the rest of cross-cultural competence learning, also known as 3C, is built. The first brick of our foundation is what is known as culture general, the more or less universal aspects of all culture groups. Every culture appears to have some key components around which they organize themselves. The remaining blocks aren't completely separable from one another, but are rather a set of interrelated skills that foster inter- and cross-cultural communication and understanding. Culture general expands to the broader concept of culture learning, the how and why of learning about one's own culture, as well as learning about the cultures of others. Perspective taking involves analyzing the behaviors of individuals and/or groups from both emic and etic actor perspectives, in other words, from both insider and outsider points of view. This very much bleeds into sense-making, which takes perspective taking to the next level by re-evaluating behaviors through a culture general lens. The emphasis here is on exploring the connection between culture general domains and their specific manifestations in the observable behaviors. Let's take the practice of tipping a waiter or waitress in the US versus the same practice in Germany. I will assume most of you are familiar with the US practice, but for those of you unfamiliar with the German way of doing things, here you go. In Germany, one typically does not tip more than 7 to 10%. If, for instance, my bill was 18 euros, giving the waiter 19 euros would be perfectly acceptable. For groups of 6 or more, a gratuity of 10% is expected, but not usually automatically charged. Another difference comes in the payment method of the tip, at least where cash is concerned. In the US, we typically leave the tip on the table. In Germany, you provide the tip with the payment directly to the waiter or waitress. If my bill is 18 euros, I might give the waiter a 20 euro bill and say 19, thereby telling him I expect 1 euro in change and the difference is his to keep. To try and make sense of this behavior, we might start discussing the fact that German waitstaff are paid a living wage, as they are specifically trained as waiters and waitresses as their vocation and belong to a union. We might then explore why the majority of jobs in Germany are unionized, or speculate about the value Germans put on vocation, vacation, free time, etc., as manifested in the emergence and endurance of German unions and workers' rights. The focus would be placed on getting from the practice to the underlying belief structure. The goal here is not to come up with the right answer, but to explore the reasonable possibilities that may provide insight into the discussed behavior, and, potentially, other possible behaviors that might be extrapolated. Although we start exploring our home culture as part of culture learning, we need to dedicate a certain amount of time to specifically address cultural self-awareness. This is important for comparative analysis, of course, but the primary objective is in identifying and, hopefully, mitigating our inherent cultural biases, also known as home culture bias. Our final foundational block is an introduction to cross-cultural communication, CCC as opposed to 3C. Most of us are competent in effectively communicating with some or most social groups, let's call them microcultures, within our own society, though the success of that communication may vary widely. We consciously and unconsciously communicate through different channels with or independent of the language. In social communicative contexts, we are relatively fast learners, figuring out how to get one's point across or understand what's being heard as a matter of need tends to speed the process of at least learning what's required to get by. Getting additional instruction and training in cross-cultural communication will capitalize on this somewhat intrinsic skill and develop it into a more widely applicable and used skill both within our own macroculture and applied to foreign cultures. These last 5 terms, cross-cultural communication, cultural self-awareness, sense-making, perspective-taking, and culture learning, comprise the 5 skill areas that can be honed to increase one's overall cross-cultural competence. Combined, these building blocks comprise some of the primary knowledge and skill areas of cross-cultural competence. The ability to navigate in complex interpersonal situations, express or interpret ideas or concepts across cultures, and make sense of foreign social and cultural behavior. Now that we have a foundation in the terminology and in the skills we need instruction and practice in, how do we improve our 3C? This mini-course will only provide you with some of the basics. The introductory 3C learning events my company usually provide require 20 to 30 hours of active participation, and even then, we consider ourselves to only be scratching the surface of what is truly a lifelong experiential learning event. Needless to say, the treatment here is significantly abridged. But fear not, Sven and I have put together a job aid that you can download and reference. It includes 3C terms as well as a sample general versus specific culture matrix. Together with our mini-course, you'll have at least a rough sketch to start you in the right direction. In general, though, the path we'd like to put you on begins a 2-part journey. First, we recommend a different approach to culture, namely from a culture general perspective, as opposed to from a culture-specific perspective. Knowing that the Japanese bow rather than shake hands as their primary form of greeting is certainly useful information, but not particularly informative about other social norms. Instead of trying to memorize every social norm or practice, many of which will vary to great or small extent from region to region or town to town, understanding culture general domains and that specific behaviors are simply manifestations driven by the underlying values and belief tied to those general domains is far more informative and fosters understanding of people rather than memorizing actions. Second, 3C enhancement is a lifelong process. There is no one approach to people of any culture that will always be successful. Each cross-cultural experience will have its own context and require a unique approach. You must choose your paradigm. But choosing an appropriate paradigm becomes easier over time if approached systematically. Honing your 3C requires learning, practice, reflection, modification, and reapplication, which is the experiential learning cycle in a nutshell. For more on 3C and its application to instructional design, please return to Blackboard Learn to complete the activities.